St. Petersburg, winter of 1917. The largest empire in the world, controlled 23 million square kilometers, more territory than any nation in history. But in the streets, bread had disappeared. Lines to buy food lasted for days, and the Tsar's palace gleamed with gold, while the people starved to death. It wasn't a revolution that destroyed Russia. It was debt, it was inequality, it was economic authoritarianism, disguised as divine power. And today, as I look at the numbers of global debt and extreme wealth concentration, I see the same ghost walking among us. It just changed its name. This is the story of how the empire that seemed invincible collapsed from within, and why you should pay attention. Before we continue, check if you're already subscribed to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. I love knowing how far these stories reach. Now, let's go back to 1917. The Russian Empire wasn't born overnight. For 3 centuries, the Romanovs built an imperial machine that seemed unstoppable. From Ivan the Terrible to Peter the Great, from Catherine the Great to Alexander III, each Tsar expanded the borders, conquered territories, subjected entire peoples to their will. In 1900, Russia was an undisputed superpower, the breadbasket of Europe. It exported millions of tons of wheat every year. It was the world's largest oil producer, surpassing even the United States. It had gold, platinum, infinite forests, winter furs, precious minerals in quantities that seemed inexhaustible. 1/3 of the world's population lived under some form of Russian influence. St. Petersburg rivaled Paris in architectural elegance. Moscow had more churches than Rome. Russian ballet was the most refined on the planet. Russian literature produced giants like Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Chekhov, Pushkin, names that still resonate today. And the army, God, the army. More than 1 million soldiers in peacetime, the largest land military force on the European continent, capable of mobilizing 5 million men in case of war, a human ocean of grey uniforms that could flood any border. The ruble was internationally respected. Russian credit considered reliable. The Tsar's bonds sold in London, Paris, Berlin, Amsterdam. European bankers lined up to lend money to the empire that seemed eternal. The empire that would never fall. Noble families lived in palaces with hundreds of rooms. They organized balls that lasted entire weeks. They had servants for their servants. They bought European art like buying bread. The Winter Palace in St. Petersburg had 1,000 rooms. 1,000. The Hermitage housed one of the world's largest art collections. The Tsars had private trains with golden carriages. They possessed jewels worth hundreds of millions of dollars today. It was the golden age of imperial Russia. But behind all that glory, beneath all that shine, something deadly was growing in silence. Something no army could stop. Something no amount of gold could buy. Something that would make all that power, all that wealth, all that magnificence evaporate like snow under the spring sun. And that something had a simple name: systematic economic injustice. The original sin of the Russian Empire was brutally simple. They believed absolute power could replace real economics. The Tsars ruled by divine mandate. Their word was law, their will sacred. There was no real parliament with effective power. There was no constitution worth more than imperial whim. There were no real limits to the Tsar's power. And when you have absolute power over the economy, you make absolutely disastrous decisions. Error number 1, economic serfdom. Until 1861, more than 23 million Russians were serfs, slaves in everything but name, tied to the land as if they were part of it, without rights, without mobility, without education, without future. They were property, bought and sold along with the lands, inherited from fathers to sons, generation after generation of slavery disguised as tradition. When they were finally liberated in 1861, it was a farce. They didn't receive enough land to survive. The best lands, the fertile lands, the lands with water, remained in the hands of the nobility. The peasants received miserable plots on poor soil, and to top it off, they had to pay for that freedom. Redemption payments that lasted 49 years. 49 years paying for the privilege of being born a slave. 49 years indebted to the same system that had enslaved them. You freed the slave, but kept him chained to debt. You changed iron chains for paper chains. And paper chains are stronger because they're invisible. Error number 2, colonial industrialization. Russia wanted to be an industrial power. It wanted modern factories, railways, steel, machines. But instead of developing a local entrepreneurial class, instead of educating Russian engineers, instead of creating national capital, They depended on foreign money. French, English, Germans, Belgians built Russian factories. They provided the capital. They brought the technology. They trained the workers. And they took the profits. Profits flowed to Paris, London, Berlin. The technology remained foreign. The patents, foreign. The designs, foreign. Russia was a colonial economy disguised as an empire. They had the world's largest territory, but acted as an economic colony of Western Europe. They produced raw materials. They imported manufactured products. They exported wheat and oil. They imported machines and luxuries. The classic pattern of economic dependence. Error number 3. Insane military spending. Between 1870 and 1914, Russia spent between 30% and 40% of its national budget on the army and navy. 30 to 40 cents of every ruble collected. Not on education, which remained medieval. Not on civil infrastructure, which was almost non-existent outside major cities. Not on public health, where infant mortality was the highest in Europe. On cannons, on warships that would sink in the first real battle, on pretty uniforms, on malfunctioning rifles, on obsolete fortresses. They were preparing for a war they thought they could win. They didn't know that war would completely destroy them. Error number 4. External debt as a lifestyle. To finance colonial industrialization and obsessive militarism, Russia borrowed. A lot, constantly, mainly from France, which became the empire's bank. In 1914, Russian external debt was 8.8 billion gold rubles, an astronomical figure for the time. 40% of the entire national budget went to paying interest. 40 cents of every ruble just to pay for the debt of the past. Nothing remained for the future. They minted promises and called them investment. They sold the future of unborn generations and called it progress. They mortgaged an empire and called it modernization. Error number 5. Inequality as a system of government. In 1900, the richest 1% of Russia, mainly nobles and merchants, controlled 90% of cultivable land. 90%. Meanwhile, 80% of the population were peasants. They lived in medieval conditions, without education, without clean water, without medical care, with a life expectancy of 30 years. In St. Petersburg, nobles spent on a single ball what a peasant earned in his entire life. In Moscow, there were restaurants where a single dinner cost a worker's annual salary. In the countryside, families ate black bread and cabbage soup for months. It wasn't just inequality. It was a moral abyss. And so while the Tsar lived in palaces with more than 1,000 rooms, while the nobility organized balls that lasted weeks, while French bankers collected their interest, the Russian people were hungry. Real hunger. Physical hunger. Hunger that kills. It was there where the empire began to die, in every empty stomach, in every malnourished child, in every family indebted for generations. And nobody noticed. Or worse, they noticed and didn't care. Because when you're the 1%, the 99% is invisible, until it stops being so. The collapse wasn't sudden. It was an agony of decades, a slow death by 1,000 economic cuts. 1905, the first warning nobody heard. Russia lost a humiliating war against Japan, a European power, civilized, Christian, white, defeated by an Asian nation that had been feudal barely 50 years before. Unthinkable, shameful, catastrophic for imperial prestige. But that still wasn't the worst. The defeat exposed something much more dangerous: internal rot. The imperial army was poorly equipped, rifles jammed, ammunition didn't arrive, the navy was obsolete. The Japanese sank almost the entire Russian fleet in a single battle. Logistics were chaotic, the generals incompetent, corruption endemic at all levels, a paper army, a cardboard empire, and the people were furious. Bloody Sunday, when the father betrayed his children. January 1905. Sunday. Thousands of workers marched peacefully toward the Winter Palace to present a petition to the Tsar. They didn't want revolution. They didn't want communism. They wanted basic reforms, shorter working hours, wages sufficient to eat, less deadly working conditions, minimum respect for human dignity. They carried religious icons. They sang hymns. They marched with their wives and children. The imperial troops received direct orders, and they opened fire. They killed more than 1,000 people that day. Women, children, elderly, workers who only asked for justice. Blood stained the snow red in front of the Winter Palace. The Tsar, who proclaimed himself the loving father of the Russian people, ordered the massacre of his own children. The Divine Father had revealed his true face, a tyrant willing to kill to preserve his privilege. That day, something more than 1,000 people died. Faith in the Tsar died. The illusion of the benevolent father died. The last hope of peaceful reform died. The false reforms. Nicholas II, frightened, granted superficial reforms. He created the Duma, a parliament with powers so limited it was practically decorative. He promised civil liberties he never materialized. He spoke of constitutionalism while maintaining absolute power. They were lies, all lies. Every time the Duma proposed real reforms, the Tsar dissolved it. Every time a popular leader emerged, he was arrested, exiled, or assassinated. Every time the people asked for bread, they received empty promises or bullets. The system was incapable of reforming itself. It was designed to extract, not to distribute, to concentrate, not to share, to oppress, not to liberate. And meanwhile, the economy slowly bled out. The continuous economic bleeding. Inflation began to rise gradually. Food prices increased faster than wages. Purchasing power evaporated. Families that used to eat meat once a week now ate it once a month. Strikes multiplied. In 1912, there were more than 2,000 strikes with more than 700,000 participants. In 1913, more than 1,000. Workers stopped factories. Trains didn't run. Mines closed. The government responded with repression. Cossacks on horseback dispersed demonstrations, mass arrests, deportations to Siberia. But you couldn't arrest hunger. You couldn't deport desperation. But this still wasn't the end. The final blow, the true cataclysm, was still to come, and it arrived with flags, drums, and promises of glory. 1914, collective suicide begins. World War I broke out. Russia entered with absurd confidence. They had the world's largest army. They mobilized 15 million men. They were going to reach Berlin in 6 weeks. They were going to crush the Germans. They were going to prove Russia was the true power. They were going to conquer eternal glory. They lasted 3 years. And they were 3 years of unimaginable nightmare. The logistical hell. Russian logistics collapsed almost immediately. The railway system was inadequate. Supplies didn't reach the front. Ammunition ran out in days. Soldiers didn't have enough rifles. There are confirmed reports that 2 men shared a weapon. When one died, the other picked up the rifle. Think about it. Soldiers sent to battle without weapons, with orders to pick up the rifle of the dead comrade. There wasn't enough ammunition. Soldiers received orders to shoot only when they saw the enemy less than 100 meters away. There were no boots. In the Russian winter, soldiers marched with rags wrapped around their feet. Thousands died of frostbite before seeing a single German. There was no food. Rations were miserable. The bread was rotten. Meat non-existent. There was no medical care. The wounded died from simple infections. Amputations were done without anesthesia. Field hospitals were slaughterhouses. At the front, 50,000 Russians died per month. 50,000. Every month, for 3 years. The internal collapse. In the cities, the situation was equally desperate. Factories were converted to military production. Weapons instead of clothing. Ammunition instead of tools. Steel for cannons instead of steel for bridges. The civilian economy simply ceased to exist. Prices skyrocketed. Bread that cost 3 kopecks in 1914 cost 18 kopecks in 1917. Coal was scarce in the middle of the Russian winter, where temperatures reached 30 degrees. People burned furniture to avoid freezing to death. In the countryside, peasants were massively recruited. Young men disappeared. Harvests were lost. Agricultural production fell 30%. Lines to buy bread lasted hours, sometimes days. And when you finally reached the front of the line, there was no bread. Women, the elderly, children waited in the cold. They waited and returned home empty-handed. The madness in power. And the Tsar, in his infinite wisdom, decided to personally assume command of the army in 1915. He left St. Petersburg. He left the government. He left the empire's administration in the hands of his wife Alexandra. Alexandra, a German princess in the middle of a war against Germany, a deeply unpopular woman who barely spoke Russian correctly. And worse still, he left real power in the hands of Rasputin. Rasputin, an illiterate Siberian peasant who proclaimed himself a mystical healer and prophet, a drunkard, a womanizer, a complete charlatan who manipulated the Tsarina because he supposedly cured her hemophiliac son. Rasputin appointed and dismissed ministers. He sold imperial favors to the highest bidder. He made decisions about the war, about the economy, about the fate of 170 million people. The empire wasn't governed by a statesman, nor by an economist, not even by a military man. It was governed by a mad monk, and everyone knew it. The nobles knew it, the generals knew it, foreign diplomats knew it, and especially the people knew it. The regime's legitimacy was completely destroyed. February 1917, the final moment. On February 23, 1917, March 8th in the modern calendar, it was International Women's Day. The women of St. Petersburg took to the streets. They didn't want revolution. They didn't want communism. They didn't want complex political philosophies. They wanted bread. Just that. Bread to feed their children. They shouted, "Bread! Bread!" The police tried to disperse them. The Cossacks arrived, traditionally the most loyal to the Tsar, the most brutal in repression. But this time something changed. The Cossacks didn't charge against the women. The soldiers refused to shoot. They refused. For the first time in the empire's history, the army said no. And then they did something unthinkable. They joined the protesters. Soldiers shared their bread with the women. They dismounted from their horses. They removed their imperial insignias. In 5 days, it was all over. The army, the only institution that sustained the regime, the only force that could maintain order, had just changed sides. On March 2, 1917, Nicholas II abdicated. 300 years of Romanov dynasty ended in a train car in the middle of nowhere. And the empire that proclaimed itself eternal, that controlled 1/6 of the Earth's surface, that had the world's largest army, that possessed unimaginable resources, fell in 5 days. 5 days between the first protests and the Tsar's abdication. Because when 99% of the people are hungry and 1% live in golden palaces, you don't need years of revolution. You only need the soldiers to refuse to shoot. Now imagine the scenes. Close your eyes and visualize. St. Petersburg, March 1917. The Winter Palace, that majestic symbol of absolute power, is assaulted not by foreign enemies, but by its own citizens. The golden doors are forced open, the windows broken. Workers, laborers with calloused hands, peasants with straw boots, soldiers with torn uniforms, walk through the halls where only nobles once walked. The statues of the Tsars, those marble figures that look down with superiority from their pedestals, are toppled. The sound of marble breaking against the floor resonates through the corridors. The imperial portraits, paintings that cost fortunes, are torn from the walls and thrown into bonfires in the square. The double-headed eagle, symbol of the empire for centuries, is ripped from every facade, from every government building. In their place, red flags, red like the blood of Bloody Sunday, red like the rage accumulated for generations. In the factories, workers take control. They expel the foremen who beat them. They expel the supervisors who robbed them. They form councils, the Soviets, where they decide collectively. They decree the 8-hour workday on their own, without waiting for anyone's permission. They distribute the stored food. They open the locked warehouses. For the first time in their lives, they decide their own destiny. In the countryside, peasants invade the estates. They burn the debt records, those papers that kept them enslaved. They watch as flames consume the deeds, the contracts, the mortgages of generations. They distribute the land among themselves, the land they worked for centuries but never owned, the land watered with their sweat and blood. The former lords flee or are expelled. Their mansions are looted, their furniture burned to heat the homes of the poor, their jewels distributed or melted down. The monetary collapse. The imperial ruble becomes worthless paper. Banks close their doors. Stores are empty. Formal commerce disappears. People exchange directly. Bread for firewood, meat for clothing, work for food, money, that abstract concept that sustained the entire social structure, simply stops meaning anything. The mass desertion. At the front, soldiers simply leave. They abandon their trenches. They leave their positions. They walk home. Millions of men walking hundreds, thousands of kilometers back to their villages. They carry their rifles. They form local militias to protect their communities. The world's largest army dissolves in weeks. Like snow under the sun, the provisional government, the illusion of order. Alexander Kerensky tries to maintain some order. He promises free elections. He promises democratic reforms. He promises to continue the war until victory. But nobody believes him. People are fed up with politicians' promises. They want peace. They want land. They want bread, not words. October 1917, the second blow. And then Lenin appears, an exile who arrives in a sealed train from Germany, like a virus sent to infect the dying body of the empire. A professional revolutionary with a brutally simple message: all power to the Soviets. Immediate peace, land for the peasants, bread for the workers. 3 promises: simple, direct, concrete. In October 1917, the Bolsheviks seize power in a coup with almost no resistance, almost without shots. The Winter Palace is taken by armed workers. The provisional government flees or is arrested, and the real tragedy begins. The hell that followed: civil war, whites against reds, monarchists against communists. Terror everywhere. Red terror, mass executions of nobles, bourgeois, priests, anyone suspected of imperial sympathies. White terror, mass executions of communists, Jews, intellectuals, anyone suspected of Bolshevik sympathies. Massive famines. In 1921 to 1922, between 5 and 10 million people died of hunger. Cannibalism became common in some regions, parents eating their own dead children, summary executions, concentration camps, deportations to Siberia, entire villages erased from the map. The end of the Romanovs, July 1918, Ekaterinburg, a dark, damp basement. The imperial family, Nicholas, Alexandra, their 5 children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, Alexei, innocent in everything except their surname. An execution squad enters. The Bolsheviks fear the whites will rescue the Tsar and turn him into a symbol of restoration. They shoot. The bullets bounce off the princesses' corsets where they had sewn jewels to hide them. They have to use bayonets and rifle butts to finish the job. The bodies are dissolved in acid and thrown into an abandoned mine. The empire that proclaimed itself eternal, that claimed to be blessed by God, that affirmed the Tsar ruled by divine right, ended with bullets, bayonets, and acid in an anonymous basement. The total human cost. Between 1917 and 1922, between 7 and 12 million Russians died. Some say up to 15 million, not by foreign invasion, not by natural disasters, by the implosion of their own economic and political system. When money dies, the empire dies, and when the empire dies, everything dies with it: families, communities, civilization itself. And now, let me show you why this story matters today, why you should be paying attention, why these aren't just dusty history lessons but urgent warnings for our present. Debt, then and now. Russia's external debt in 1914 represented 40% of its GDP. The national budget dedicated 40% of its resources just to paying interest on that debt. The United States federal debt in 2024 is 123% of its GDP, 123%, 3 times worse than Imperial Russia. In 2024, the United States spends more than $800 billion annually just on debt interest, just on interest, more than the education budget, more than the housing budget, more than the transportation budget, and the figure grows exponentially every year. Military spending, then and now. Russia spent between 30% and 40% of its national budget on the army, on preparing for wars, on maintaining an empire that stretched across 11 time zones. The United States spends more than $800 billion annually on defense, more than the next 10 countries combined. It has more than 750 military bases in more than 80 countries. It's not defense, it's empire. And empires are expensive, very expensive, unsustainably expensive. Inequality, then and now. In Imperial Russia, the richest 1% controlled 90% of cultivable land, the most valuable asset of the time. In the United States today, the richest 1% controls 40% of all national wealth. The 0.1% controls more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. In Russia, there were nobles who lived in palaces with hundreds of rooms, while peasants starved to death in unheated huts. Today, there are billionaires with yachts that have smaller yachts inside, with mansions that have more bathrooms than inhabitants, with private jets for their private jets. Meanwhile, in the United States, 34 million people live in poverty. 1 in 5 children doesn't have food security. 500,000 people are homeless every night. Wages then and now. In Imperial Russia, real wages fell for decades while productivity rose. Profits went to the nobility, to the landowners, to foreign investors. In the United States, The average real wage, adjusted for inflation, is practically the same as in 1973, 50 years without real growth. Meanwhile, worker productivity doubled. Where did those gains go? To shareholders, to executives, to the 1%. Money printing, then and now. In Russia, the government printed money uncontrollably to finance the war. Inflation eroded people's savings while the rich converted their assets into gold and properties abroad. Since 2020, the United States Federal Reserve has expanded its balance sheet by more than $5 trillion. $5 trillion. Printed out of nothing, created with a computer click, and inflation arrived. Food prices rose 25%. Housing became inaccessible for an entire generation. Meanwhile, billionaires doubled their wealth. Asset prices skyrocketed. Stocks, properties, cryptocurrencies, everything the 1% owns became more valuable. The people saw their money lose purchasing power. The 1% saw their wealth multiply. Political capture then and now. In Russia, the political system was completely captured by elites. The Duma was a theater without real power. Reforms were impossible because they threatened the interests of nobles and industrialists. Today in the United States, corporations spend billions on lobbying. Politicians receive massive donations from the same interests they should regulate. Laws are written by corporate lawyers. Citizens United allowed unlimited corporate money in politics. The revolving doors between government and the private sector are shameless. Regulators end up working for the companies they regulated. It's not democracy, it's oligarchy with elections, the erosion of institutional trust. In Russia, when the system collapsed, there was nobody to defend it. Soldiers refused to shoot. Police removed their badges. Bureaucrats abandoned their offices. Because when a system only benefits those at the top, those at the bottom have no incentive to maintain it. Today we see the same erosion of trust. Trust in government is at historic lows. Trust in media at historic lows. Trust in institutions at historic lows. People no longer believe. They no longer trust. They no longer have faith that the system works for them. And when faith dies, only inertia remains. And inertia eventually stops. The warning signs. We see extreme inequality reaching levels not seen since 1914. We see the capture of the political system by financial interests. We see constant militarization. We see unpayable debt growing exponentially. And above all, we see the arrogance of elites who believe they're too big to fall. The Romanovs believed it too. They had the world's largest army. They had the vastest territory. They had resources that seemed infinite. They had the church's support. They had divine power on their side. And they fell in 5 days. 5 days between the first protests for bread and the Tsar's abdication. The ignored lesson. Because no empire survives when the people are hungry and the palaces remain full. None. Never. In any era. You can have the largest army. You can have the most advanced weapons. You can have the most sophisticated surveillance system. But if your people don't have food, if they don't have hope, if they don't see a future, it's only a matter of time. History doesn't repeat exactly, but it rhymes. And right now, we're hearing the echo of 1917. The numbers rhyme, the policies rhyme, the arrogance rhymes, the inequality rhymes. Only the names of the currencies changed, and the colors of the flags, and the titles of the rulers. But the melody is the same. And we know how the song ends. The uncomfortable question. So what will happen? I don't know. I'm not a prophet. But I know what history says. I know that when debt becomes unpayable, someone pays the price. Usually it's not the creditors. I know that when inequality reaches certain levels, systems become unstable, and instability has unpredictable consequences. I know that when people lose faith in institutions, they seek alternatives. And those alternatives aren't always rational or peaceful. I know that empires fall. All of them fall, without exception in all human history. And I know that when they fall, the pain is massive, because the collapse of an economic system isn't abstract. It's hunger, it's violence, it's destroyed families, it's torn communities, it's hell on earth. The difference with Russia. There's a crucial difference, however. Russia in 1917 didn't have nuclear weapons. It didn't have interconnected global financial systems. It didn't have financial derivatives measured in hundreds of trillions. The Russian collapse was geographically contained. It was horrible, but it was local. A collapse of the current system would be global, instantaneous, total. Supply chains would stop in days, banking systems in hours, communications in minutes, and nobody knows what would happen next, Because it's never happened before at this scale, the choice. So we have a choice as societies. We can follow the path of imperial Russia. We can maintain extreme inequality. We can keep accumulating unpayable debt. We can keep believing that those at the top are immune to consequences. And eventually, we'll pay the price. As Russia paid it, as all empires pay it. Or we can learn. We can make real reforms before it's too late. We can redistribute before redistribution becomes violent. We can reform before reform becomes revolutionary. But the window is closing, and it closes a little more each day. Because history has a very clear lesson. You can have peaceful reforms or violent revolutions, but the unsustainable status quo is not one of the options. It never has been. When money dies, everything else dies with it. The Russian Empire didn't fall due to foreign invasion. It didn't fall due to natural disasters. It didn't fall due to bad luck. It fell because they built an economy that only worked for those at the top. Because they confused repression with stability. Because they believed military power could compensate for economic injustice. It couldn't. It never can. Russia's lesson is brutal, but crystal clear. You can have all the gold in the world, all the soldiers in the world, all the territory in the world, but if your people don't have food, if they don't have hope, if they don't see a future, if every day is a struggle to survive while others swim in obscene luxury, you have nothing. You only have borrowed time, and that time eventually runs out. And when it runs out, everything falls, the palaces, the crowns, the dynasties that believed themselves eternal, the systems that proclaimed themselves permanent. Everything falls, and the noise it makes falling is the sound of millions of destroyed lives. Today in 2024, I see the same patterns repeating. I see governments accumulating debt they'll never be able to pay. I see inequality reaching levels that history tells us are unsustainable. I see political systems completely captured by modern oligarchs. And I see elites who believe all this can continue indefinitely, who believe they're different, who believe this time is different. It's not, it never is. The Romanovs believed it. The Tsar considered himself anointed by God. He believed his power was divine and unshakable. He believed the Russian people would always love him. And he died in a basement with his family, shot by his own subjects, not out of cruelty, not out of personal hatred, but out of desperation, out of hunger, out of generations of accumulated injustice that finally exploded. History screams this lesson. Rome screamed it. Spain screamed it. Great Britain screamed it. Russia screamed it with special force. And now it's our turn to decide if we're going to listen or if we're going to repeat the same mistake once more. Because the financial crisis that collapsed the Russian Empire didn't disappear. It didn't evaporate. It wasn't resolved. It's just coming back with another name, with other faces, with other flags, but the same song, the same story, the same tragic and inevitable ending, unless we choose to write a different ending. But time is running out, and history waits for no one. No empire survives when the people are hungry and the palaces remain full. None. In the next episode of our series, discover how the gold crisis destroyed the Western Roman Empire and erased 500 years of civilization in just 2 generations. The same story, different century, same forgotten lesson. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss this saga of fallen empires and economic prophecies that are being fulfilled right now. Activate the bell, share this video, because these lessons aren't just for understanding the past, they're for surviving the future. When money dies, the empire dies. And when the empire dies, well, you know what comes next. History already showed you. See you at the next collapse.